The recording lasted 43 seconds. The prosecutor, a woman named Andrea Vasquez with sharp eyes and a sharper voice, played it twice for the jury. The second time, she turned up the volume so every word filled the courtroom. What if he has an episode while we're gone? Then he has an episode. It's 112 degrees outside, and the AC is off. His heart isn't exactly what it used to be. Could look like natural causes. Daniel, you're talking about my father. I'm talking about $3 million and a house that's worth another $800,000. Think about that instead. A pause on the recording. Long enough that I watched two jurors shift in their seats. Just make sure the door locks from the outside when we leave. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the air conditioning humming overhead. My daughter sat at the defense table with her hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. Her husband, Daniel, sat beside her with an expression that had long since stopped pretending to be anything other than contempt. Their attorney, a heavy-set man named Gerald Foster, was already writing notes on a yellow legal pad, like the recording hadn't just described, leaving a 67-year-old man with a documented heart condition locked outside his own home. On the hottest day Phoenix had recorded in 11 years. I was sitting in the front row of the gallery. My attorney, Carol Dempsey, had told me to keep my face neutral. Don't smile, don't react, don't give the defense anything to use. I'd spent 31 years as a cardiologist, which meant I'd spent 31 years keeping my face neutral while delivering news that shattered people. I knew how to do this. I watched my daughter, and I kept my face very still. I had known something was wrong 8 months before that recording was ever played in court. You don't spend 3 decades reading people, patients, families, colleagues without developing a sense for when you're being managed. And my daughter had been managing me for the better part of a year. It started small. The way she began asking questions about my finances that had nothing to do with anything. Not curious questions, not the kind a daughter asks because she's worried about her aging father's retirement planning. Specific questions. What was the current value of the Scottsdale property? Whether I'd ever considered a living trust. What exactly happened to assets when someone was declared legally incapacitated? That word. Incapacitated. She used it the first time over dinner at her house in Tempe, and she delivered it so smoothly, so casually tucked between the salad course and the main, that I almost let it pass. Almost. I'd been a physician long enough to know that the word incapacitated never entered a conversation by accident. I didn't say anything that night. I filed it away. Over the following weeks, I started noticing other things. My daughter began dropping by the house more frequently, but the visits felt like inspections. She walked through rooms with the particular attention of someone cataloging. She asked about the artwork, about the antique clock in the study that had belonged to my late wife's family, about the cars in the garage. Her husband, Daniel, had stopped pretending to like me approximately 18 months into their marriage. Now he made no effort at all. When he came to the house, which was rarely, he walked through it the way people walk through a property they're about to purchase. I called my attorney in October. Carol Dempsey specialized in elder law, which I had learned was an entire legal subspecialty that existed precisely because what was happening to me happened to a great many people. She wasn't surprised by anything I told her. She'd heard it all before. They're building a case to have you declared incompetent, she said. Do you have a current will? I did. I drafted it 4 years earlier, shortly after my wife passed. My daughter was the primary beneficiary. At the time, that had seemed obvious. We need to revise it, Carol said, and we need to do it quietly. We revised the will in November. Carol also helped me establish a new power of attorney, not with my daughter, but with my younger brother in San Diego, a man named Patrick, who had spent 20 years as an accountant and who my daughter had never much liked because he had a talent for seeing through people. I told no one. Carol filed the documents and kept them in her office safe. I also, on the advice of a private security consultant Carol recommended, installed a home monitoring system. Not the visible kind, I already had those. A Ring doorbell and 2 outdoor cameras my daughter knew about. I mean the other kind. Small, professional-grade devices placed in the main living areas and the study where I kept my financial records. Motion-activated, cloud-backed, accessible only through an encrypted account my daughter didn't know existed. I felt like a man boarding up windows before a hurricane he wasn't sure was coming. Then January arrived, and I found the documents. I hadn't been looking for them. I'd been in my study reviewing some investment statements when I noticed that a folder in my filing cabinet, the one containing my original will and the deed to the Scottsdale house, was slightly out of position. I kept meticulous files. 31 years of medical records had made organization a reflex. Nothing in that cabinet was ever out of position. The will was still there. But when I held it up to the lamp, I noticed something about the signature page. The ink was slightly different, not dramatically, not in a way that would jump out at a casual observer, but I had signed that document myself. I knew exactly how my signature looked on a page, the particular weight of the pen I'd used that day. This wasn't it. Someone had replaced the signature page. I photographed every page with my phone, sent the images to Carol within the hour, and said nothing to anyone. Carol compared the documents against her copy of the original. The new signature page named my daughter as sole beneficiary of everything, with a provision that she could immediately assume control of my accounts in the event I was deemed unable to manage my own affairs. The original had included a charitable trust and had placed my brother Patrick as financial executor. Someone had access to your files, Carol said, and they knew exactly what they were looking for. My daughter had a key to the house. She'd had one for years. I hadn't thought anything of it. I thought plenty about it now. Carol advised me to say nothing, to act normal, to give them no indication that I'd discovered anything. We contacted the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office in February, laid out what we had, and Detective Ramos from the Financial Crimes Unit began a parallel investigation. He was a methodical man with reading glasses he was always losing and a habit of taking notes in the margins of documents rather than on fresh paper. I liked him immediately. "Let them keep going," he told me. "The more they do, the more we have." It was the longest spring of my life. My daughter escalated in March. She started sending me articles about memory care facilities. Not subtly, she forwarded them to my email with subject lines like, "Thought this might be useful," and "Just keeping our options open, Dad." She mentioned twice, in the same week, that she'd heard from a friend whose father had really benefited from having someone manage his affairs. I forwarded every email to Carol and Detective Ramos. In April, my daughter and Daniel took me to lunch at a restaurant in Scottsdale and introduced me to a woman named Patricia Owens, who, they explained, was an estate planning specialist who could help me simplify my financial situation. Patricia had a lot of hair and a very practiced smile, and a briefcase full of documents that she wanted me to sign that afternoon. I glanced at the documents. Among them was a durable power of attorney that would have given my daughter complete and immediate authority over every financial decision in my life. I told them I appreciated it but wanted my own attorney to review anything before I signed. Daniel's smile didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. I mentioned it to Carol that evening. She said, "Good, they're getting impatient. Impatient people make mistakes." The mistake came in June. Phoenix in June is not a place for the faint of heart, or, as it turned out, for a 67-year-old man with a documented history of atrial fibrillation that his daughter's husband had access to from 3 years of eavesdropping on family conversations. The heat index that week reached 112 degrees, the kind of heat that kills people every summer in the valley, mostly elderly people, mostly the ones who can't get to air conditioning. My daughter called on a Thursday morning and asked if she and Daniel could come by that afternoon to talk through some things. I said, of course. I put fresh coffee on. I sat in my living room and waited and felt, for the first time in 8 months, genuinely afraid. Not of them, of what I was about to let them do. They arrived at 2 o'clock. My daughter was dressed for the heat in a pale linen dress. Daniel wore that expression he'd been wearing for 2 years, the one that meant he was doing math in his head. They sat across from me in the living room, and my daughter said, without preamble, that she and Daniel had made an appointment with a physician colleague of mine, someone I'd known for 20 years who had agreed to conduct a cognitive evaluation, and that they believed it was time for me to formally step back from managing my own affairs. I asked her why she thought that was necessary. She said I'd been showing signs, forgetting things, getting confused. She had examples ready. A list of incidents I recognized as either completely fabricated or so minor that a person would need to be actively looking for evidence to characterize them as concerning. I listened to all of it. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I thought about my wife, who had died in this house, in the bedroom down the hall, with my hand in hers. I thought about the 31 years I'd spent keeping people's hearts beating. I thought about what Carol had said 6 months ago. They chose this path. Your job is just to make sure they can't get off it. When my daughter finished speaking, I told her I needed some air, that I was going to step outside for a few minutes, and wanted them to wait for me. I walked through the kitchen and out the back door to the patio. Behind me, I heard the soft mechanical click of a door locking that I had not locked. I stood in 112 degrees of Phoenix afternoon heat and understood, with the particular clarity that comes from being absolutely right about something you desperately hoped you were wrong about, that my daughter and her husband had just locked me out of my own house. My phone was inside. My wallet was inside. My heart medication was inside. What was not inside, because I had placed it there that morning, in the pocket of my slacks. On the advice of Detective Ramos, who had suggested I always have a way to contact him regardless of circumstances, was a small, secondary cell phone, prepaid, registered to my brother Patrick. I called Detective Ramos from behind my own oleander bushes in 112 degrees and told him the moment had arrived. He was at my house within 20 minutes. My daughter and Daniel were still inside. They had, according to the monitoring system footage we reviewed later, spent those 20 minutes going through my filing cabinet, photographing documents, and making 3 phone calls, 2 to a number that turned out to belong to Patricia Owens, the estate planning specialist, and 1 to a storage facility in Tempe, where it emerged they had already rented a unit. They had also, during those 20 minutes, changed the thermostat setting from 72 degrees to 94. Detective Ramos arrested them in my living room. I watched from the front porch, now fully unlocked, drinking a glass of ice water my neighbor Margaret had brought over when she saw the police cruisers. Margaret was 73 and sharp as a tack, and had known something was wrong with my daughter and Daniel since the previous Christmas when Daniel had loudly asked me, at my own dinner table, what I planned to do with the Scottsdale house when I couldn't manage it anymore. That man has been waiting for you to die since before you were sick, she'd told me in January. She wasn't wrong. The charges took shape over the following weeks as Detective Ramos and Carol Dempsey laid out the full picture. It was more comprehensive than even I had realized. My daughter and Daniel had been planning this for at least 2 years. The forged will signature page. An application, filed without my knowledge, to initiate guardianship proceedings. 3 credit cards opened in my name using a combination of my personal information and a forged letter of authorization, carrying a combined balance of just over $90,000 in charges, spa retreats, a boat Daniel had wanted, home renovations on their Tempe property. The Patricia Owens meeting had been a setup to obtain my signature on documents that would have immediately and the afternoon in June. The locked door, the disabled thermostat. The 2 of them 35 miles away at a resort in Sedona, with an airtight alibi story already prepared, while a 67-year-old man with a heart condition stood alone in 112-degree heat with no phone and no water. The DA charged Daniel with attempted murder, fraud, forgery, identity theft, and conspiracy. My daughter faced the same charges on all counts, except attempted murder, where the prosecution argued she was an active and knowing participant rather than a secondary influence. Foster, their defense attorney, had his work cut out for him, and he knew it. The trial began on a Tuesday in November, 8 months after the afternoon on my patio. The courtroom had the particular energy of a case where the outcome was not entirely certain, despite the weight of evidence, because juries are human, and human beings sometimes find ways to introduce mercy where the law does not require it. My attorney had warned me about this. They're going to make you look like the villain, Carol told me, like a cold, calculating man who engineered his own daughter's downfall. Be prepared for that. I had been prepared for it for 8 months. Foster's opening argument was actually well constructed. He acknowledged the facts, the credit cards, the locked door, the altered will. He didn't try to make those disappear. Instead, he built a narrative around them. A desperate couple drowning in debt, a daughter who loved her father, but had been pulled into a series of increasingly bad decisions by a husband who dominated and manipulated her, a situation that had escalated beyond what anyone intended. He was careful never to explicitly call Daniel a monster, But he laid the scaffolding for the jury to believe that my daughter was a victim twice over, once of her husband's influence, and once of a father who had chosen prosecution over reconciliation. I watched my daughter while Foster spoke. She was dressed conservatively, minimal makeup, her hair pulled back. She looked like someone who had been professionally coached to look like someone who was sorry. The prosecution's case took 4 days. Andrea Vasquez walked the jury through the monitoring footage, the phone records, the forged documents, the credit card statements, the thermostat logs from my smart home system showing the temperature change at 2:18 p.m. on the afternoon they locked me out. She called Detective Ramos, who testified with the methodical precision of a man who had spent 20 years building cases that didn't fall apart on cross-examination. She called the forensic document examiner who had compared the forged signature page to 11 samples of my authentic signature and found 17 points of inconsistency. Then she called Margaret. My neighbor walked to the stand in her good blue dress and testified in the calm, unhurried voice of a woman who has seen a great deal of life and has no patience for dishonesty. She described Daniel's comment at Christmas dinner. She described the visits my daughter made to the house that felt, in her word, clinical. She described the afternoon in June when she'd watched 2 police cars pull into my driveway and felt, in her words, not at all surprised. Foster cross-examined her for 20 minutes and got nothing useful. The moment Foster had been waiting for came at the end of the prosecution's evidence presentation, when Vasquez called me to the stand. I had testified in court before. Not often, but a cardiologist occasionally finds himself giving expert testimony in cases involving cardiac events, workplace injuries, malpractice disputes. I knew what a witness stand felt like. I knew how to speak slowly enough for a jury to follow and quickly enough not to lose them. Foster started where I expected him to start. Dr. Calloway, you installed hidden cameras in your home without telling your daughter. I installed a home security system after I discovered my files had been accessed without my permission. Security cameras are standard components of home security systems, but you didn't tell her they were there. I don't typically announce my security measures to people who may intend to rob me. A few jurors shifted. One of them, a woman in the second row who had been taking notes throughout the trial, looked up. That's a rather adversarial way to describe your own daughter, Foster said. She rather adversarially forged my signature and charged $90,000 to credit cards she opened in my name without my knowledge. I think the characterization is accurate. Foster moved on. He spent the next hour trying to establish that I had engineered a trap, that I had deliberately withheld the knowledge that my files had been accessed, that I had allowed my daughter to continue her plan rather than confronting her, that I had, in his words, set the stage for her prosecution. I let him build the argument. Then I answered, "You're suggesting I should have confronted them, yes? I'm suggesting a father who genuinely wanted to protect his relationship with his daughter would have tried to talk to her. I tried to talk to my daughter for 2 years. I told her I was concerned about the direction of her marriage. I told her I felt her husband's influence was not positive. She told me I was jealous of her happiness and out of touch. So I'd like to know what conversation you believe I hadn't tried. But you didn't tell her you'd discovered the forged will." "No, because the moment I told her, they would have stopped, and there would have been no evidence, and the next time would have been better planned and harder to catch." I looked at Foster steadily. "I'm a physician. When a patient presents symptoms, you don't announce your diagnostic suspicions and hope the disease cooperates. You gather information and you confirm your findings before you act. So you treated your daughter like a patient. I treated a dangerous situation with the seriousness it deserved." Foster sat down. He had one more angle, and he used it. "Dr. Calloway, isn't it true that your daughter has struggled financially throughout her adult life, and that you have, on multiple occasions, declined to provide significant financial assistance?" I considered the question for a moment. I paid for her college education. I provided a down payment on her first home. I co-signed a business loan that was never repaid. I covered 2 rounds of fertility treatments that she and Daniel ultimately abandoned. I am not certain what level of assistance would have satisfied the threshold for significant, but I believe the record suggests I was not an ungenerous father. And yet your estate, as currently structured, leaves your daughter nothing. My estate, as currently structured, reflects my assessment of who should benefit from what I spent my life building. I paused. My daughter made her assessment of what she deserved. The jury will make theirs. There was no outburst in the gallery, no dramatic moment, just the weight of what had been said settling over a very quiet room. The jury deliberated for 2 days. I spent both days at home, in the Scottsdale house I had lived in for 22 years, in the chair by the window where I used to read on Sunday mornings with my wife. Margaret came over on the second afternoon with a casserole, and we sat in the kitchen and talked about neither the trial nor our children, and it was the most peaceful 2 hours I'd spent since October of the previous year. The call came at 3:47 p.m. on a Thursday. The courtroom reconvened at 5 o'clock. My daughter and Daniel were let in. Daniel's expression had finally changed. Whatever calculation had lived behind his eyes for 2 years had been replaced by something rawer and less composed. My daughter looked at me when she sat down, the first direct look she'd given me in 3 days of testimony. I couldn't read it. I had spent my entire career learning to read people, and I could not read my daughter's face in that moment, which told me something about how far we had come from the father and daughter we had been. The jury filed in. The foreperson, a man in his 60s with a gray beard and the careful posture of someone who understood the weight of what he was holding, addressed the judge. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree against Daniel Hargrove. Guilty. My daughter made a sound I had not heard from her since she was very small. On the charge of fraud against Daniel Hargrove. Guilty. Forgery. Guilty. Identity theft. Guilty. Conspiracy. Guilty. The foreperson turned to my daughter's charges. Fraud. Guilty. Forgery. Guilty. Identity theft. Guilty. Conspiracy. Guilty. Attempted murder in the first degree. The courtroom held its breath. Guilty. The sound that came from the defense table was Daniel's chair scraping back as he lurched forward and was restrained by the bailiff. Foster put a hand on my daughter's arm. She was crying, not performed crying, not the careful presentation she'd maintained throughout the trial. Real, collapsed, irreversible crying, the kind that acknowledges that something is over. I sat in the front row and did not look away. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. Foster made his arguments, which were competent and insufficient. He cited my daughter's lack of prior record, her emotional dependence on a controlling spouse, the absence of any prior violent behavior. He argued for the minimum under sentencing guidelines. Vasquez countered with the thermostat. Your Honor, 94 degrees inside a sealed house in Phoenix in June, with the outdoor temperature at 112. The defendant is a 67-year-old physician with documented atrial fibrillation. These defendants knew his medical history. They knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what the likely result would be. The only reason Dr. Calloway is alive to testify in this courtroom is because he had the foresight to keep a second phone and the presence of mind to use it. The judge, a woman named Honorable Patricia Chen, who had the energy of someone who had stopped tolerating nonsense approximately a decade ago, listened to both sides with her hands folded on the bench. Daniel Hargrove, she said, you are sentenced to 22 years in the Arizona Department of Corrections. Daniel closed his eyes. On the question of your wife's sentence, the court acknowledges the defense's argument regarding spousal influence, but does not accept it as mitigation for what the evidence clearly demonstrates was active and knowing participation in every phase of this scheme, including the events of June 11th. Judge Chen looked at my daughter directly. You had every opportunity to stop this at any point. You did not. Lindsay Hargrove, you are sentenced to 16 years in the Arizona Department of Corrections. They were jointly liable for $214,000 in restitution, covering the credit card charges, legal fees, and damages. Their attorney asked about their ability to pay. Judge Chen said their assets would be liquidated accordingly, and whatever remained would follow them out of prison. The 2 cars in the Tempe driveway, the furniture, the boat Daniel had charged to my card, the jewelry Lindsay had bought at a Scottsdale boutique using a credit card she'd opened in my name the previous December. All of it cataloged, seized, scheduled for auction. After the courtroom cleared, I asked Carol if I could have a moment with my daughter before she was taken back. Carol looked at me for a moment. Are you sure? I was sure. They brought Lindsay to a small anteroom off the main corridor, still in her court clothes, her hands cuffed in front of her. She looked at me the way you look at someone when you've run out of things to say and run out of ways to avoid saying them. I stood across from her and tried to find in her face the child I had raised. I found traces of her, the shape of her eyes, the way she held her chin when she was trying not to cry. My late wife had held her chin exactly that way. "I want you to understand something," I said. "Everything I had, the house, the accounts, the Scottsdale property, I was always going to leave it to you. You were my daughter. Whatever our disagreements, I intended to leave you well provided for. I let that land. All you had to do was wait." She looked at the floor. "You didn't have to scheme. Didn't have to lie. Didn't have to lock your father outside in 112 degrees and drive to Sedona and hope the heat finished what you'd started. You could have simply been patient. Simply been decent. And you would have had everything." She didn't answer. 16 years, Lindsay. 16 years to think about that choice. I moved toward the door, then stopped. Your mother would have known what to do with this. She was always better at forgiveness than I am. But she's not here, and I am, and I can't forgive something I don't fully understand. I looked at her one last time. "Maybe in 16 years, you can explain it to me." The guard led her away. I walked out into the November afternoon, where Carol was waiting with 2 cups of coffee from the cart in the courthouse lobby. "How are you?" she asked. "Tired," I said. "Ready to be done." The house sold in February. A family from Seattle. The husband, a software architect who worked remotely and wanted space. The wife, a teacher who'd fallen in love with the desert when they'd visited for a friend's wedding. They had 2 daughters who chased each other through the backyard during the showing and argued about which bedroom would be whose. I watched them from the kitchen doorway and felt something ease in my chest that I hadn't realized was still tight. I signed the papers in Carol's conference room with a pen she lent me and forgot to return. The sale and the liquidated accounts and the investments left me. After all taxes and fees and the court-ordered restitution I'd paid on my own behalf rather than pursue the collections process, with approximately $2.1 million. I divided it 4 ways. $500,000 went to the Banner Health Foundation, which funds cardiac care programs for uninsured patients in Arizona. I had spent 31 years keeping hearts beating. It seemed appropriate to spend some of what I'd earned making sure other people got the same chance. $500,000 went to the Arizona Coalition for Elder Rights, an organization that provides legal aid to senior citizens, facing exactly what I had faced: the gradual, patient predation of people who had decided that an elderly person's assets were more valuable than the elderly person. $400,000 went into a medical school scholarship fund at the University of Arizona for students pursuing cardiology who demonstrated both academic merit and financial need. My name would not be on it. I had not built a career, so my name could appear on a plaque. The remaining funds I kept because I was 67 years old and I had plans. I moved to Tucson in March, bought a small house in a neighborhood of mature saguaros and retired professors and people who seemed to have made peace with their lives. The house had a covered patio that faced west, which meant the sunsets were extraordinary. I bought a rocking chair from a local furniture maker, handcrafted mesquite, and I put it on that patio and I sat in it on the first evening and watched the sky turn colors that no one from the Pacific Northwest ever quite believes until they see them in person. My brother Patrick drove down from San Diego for the first weekend. We sat on the patio and drank coffee and talked about nothing in particular: his grandchildren, my plans, a hiking trail he'd been on in the Catalinas that he thought I'd like when my cardiologist cleared me for altitude. We did not talk about Lindsay. We had said what there was to say. Before he left, he put a hand on my shoulder. "You okay?" he asked. Real question, not a polite one. I thought about it honestly. About the 8 months of surveillance and preparation. About the afternoon on my patio in 112 degrees, my heart beating in its irregular way while I crouched behind my own oleander bushes and waited for Detective Ramos. About sitting in the front row of a courtroom and watching my daughter learn that the choices she'd made had consequences that would define the next 16 years of her life. About the way she'd held her chin when she was trying not to cry, exactly the way her mother used to. "I'll be okay," I said. "Give me a little time." He nodded. That was enough. I had started writing in the evenings, which surprised me. I had never been a writer. I was a physician. I communicated in data and diagnosis and the careful management of uncertainty. But there was something that wanted to be set down, and the patio and the sunset and the rocking chair seemed to encourage it. I was writing about elder financial abuse, about how it begins, about the signs that most people don't recognize until they're already deep in it, about what legal tools exist and how to use them before the situation reaches the point mine had. Carol Dempsey was helping me with the legal sections. A colleague from the hospital was helping with the medical sections on cognitive decline and how it gets weaponized. We were thinking about it as a guide, something practical, something a person could give to an aging parent or receive from an adult child without either of them needing to admit they were worried. Margaret called from Phoenix on a Sunday in April, just to check in, and I told her about the project. "That'll be useful," she said, with the particular satisfaction of someone who enjoys being right. "There are a lot of people who need exactly that." "That's what I'm counting on," I said. I sat on the patio that evening, longer than usual, until the last of the light was gone, and the desert cooled, and the stars came out in the particular abundance they achieve in Tucson, away from the city glow. My neighbor across the street was walking his dog. 2 houses down, someone was having a quiet dinner on their patio, voices and laughter carrying gently on the air. I thought about hearts. I'd spent 31 years thinking about hearts, their mechanics, their failures, the 1,000 ways they could be repaired, and the handful of ways they couldn't. A heart that had been damaged didn't always recover fully. Sometimes the chambers compensated. Sometimes scar tissue formed where healthy muscle had been. Sometimes, with time and care and the right conditions, function returned in ways that exceeded what seemed medically reasonable. I was 67 years old, starting over in a city I was still learning, with a cleared conscience and a writing project, and a cardiologist who'd told me last month that my rhythm was, in her words, remarkably stable for someone who'd been through what you've been through. I picked up the coffee that had gone mostly cold. "Remarkably stable," I said, to no one in particular, and found that I believed it.